elevation.
That's right.
Kata pai.
I feel, Mr Speaker, I feel sorry for this Minister of Housing. Being the Minister of Housing in a national government is kind of like the graveyard shift. It's like being the Minister of Coal Mines. It's like being the Minister of Coal Mines in a Green-led government, or the Minister of State-owned Enterprises in an ACT-led government. Their heart just isn't in it. This national government is ideologically predisposed against the state intervening in the housing market to help New Zealanders get a secure roof over their heads, to get people out of living in caravans and cars and get them into safe, healthy, affordable homes. Sir, we support this slight, incidental bill. It can go off to the Select Committee where we can debate the pros and cons of whether policy advice should be split between Housing New Zealand or the Department of Building and Housing, or whether it should all be consolidated in the Department of Building and Housing. That's an interesting diversion, but it's utterly irrelevant to the tens of thousands of New Zealanders who are on the sharp end of the housing crisis in New Zealand today. I'm going to give the House some facts. They are readily available on television and newspaper. In fact, many New Zealanders talk of little else other than the housing crisis, but this minister doesn't seem to know them, because if he did, if he wasn't so out of touch with the concerns of ordinary New Zealanders, he would surely have come up with something better than this pathetic bill. Mr Speaker, there are 9,000 people on the waiting list for a Housing New Zealand home. The waiting list is not really a waiting list, because you can wait and wait and wait for years and nothing ever happens. It's not a list that you wait on when you want to get a house. It's a list where you just sit and nothing happens. Because, sir, the fact is there are simply not enough houses for the people that need them. In Auckland, the average price of a new home was reported this week as hitting $580,000. Now, National's recession has slowed down the increase in housing prices, but still, particularly in Auckland, we have some of the most unaffordable housing in the world. We've got a crisis in rental housing. A recent ordinary three-bedroom house in central Auckland recently was advertised for rent. It attracted 300 applicants. And as if this wasn't bad enough, the government is doing precious little to actually help New Zealanders get a roof over their heads. The latest estimates from the government's Housing Shareholders Advisory Group says there is a shortage of 70,000 dwellings. 70,000. The Department of Building and Housing have warned that there are an additional 25,000 shortfall coming down the pipeline over the next decade. And what's the best that this minister can do? What's the best answer he's got for this crisis? Well, if ever there was an example of how bereft this government is of ideas, of a plan to get New Zealand moving, this bill is it. A bill to consolidate policy making in the Department of Building and Housing. John Key, sir, has done a remake of the classic Blam 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 song from the 1980s, There Is No Depression in New Zealand, and it's There Is No Housing Crisis in New Zealand. That's what he said. He probably thinks that people who are forced to live in caravan parks and cars are making a lifestyle choice. This is the Prime Minister, the former State House kid, who intervened personally to block the building of Housing New Zealand houses in the Hobsonville development in his electorate, because he thought that giving low-income Kiwis a sea view was economic vandalism. Well, that says it all about this government. This bill, sir, is tinkering around the edges, because tinkering is what this minister does best. Under his watch, 87 properties, I think, 87 have been added to the state housing stock in 2 years. Under the fifth Labor government, we averaged nearly 1,000 new houses a year for 9 years. And what's the best this minister can do? 87 in 2 years. Well, he's introduced an options and advisory service. Is that designed to help get more New Zealanders into their own homes? No, it's a mechanism for keeping people off the waiting list. The main strategy that this government has seems to be to get people into leased private rentals. They seem to be oblivious to the fact that that's simply moving people from the public side of the ledger to the private. It does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to increase the stock of social housing or affordable housing. What's the Minister's big contribution to solving the housing crisis? Reviewable tenancies, which will create stress and uncertainty for Kiwi families while doing nothing to increase the stock of affordable housing. That is this Minister's stock and trade. Mr Speaker, in my community of Te Atatu, people are on the sharp end of the housing affordability crisis. Things are tough in West Auckland. There are about 1,000 people. There are 1,000 people on the waiting list in West Auckland. That's more than any other area in New Zealand outside of South Auckland. More often than not, they've been kicked out by the landlord who's selling the house. They don't have the money for a bond. It's about $1,000 for an average priced rental in West Auckland to pay the bond, and Housing New Zealand can't do a damn thing for them. They are often desperate. They've run out of options. There was one poor man we saw recently who had custody of his 4 children, 2 teenagers and 2 little ones. They were surviving on his sickness benefit and living in a 1-bedroom unit. Is it any wonder that he was depressed? Another case we saw recently, a husband and wife and 5 kids living in Te Atatu North. He lost his job, they couldn't pay the rent and were evicted by the landlord. Housing New Zealand could do nothing for them. The only option was to go and live in the shelter, the emergency shelter in Airedale Street in the CBD run by the Methodist Mission. They were classed priority A by Housing New Zealand, the highest priority, but they were told that they had no chance of getting a house. Another couple who came in looking for help recently with a 4-month-old baby living in their car. So why is this important? It's important because housing unaffordability drives people into poverty. It blights the life chances of a generation. Remember the impact of market rents and state housing in the 1990s. Under the national government of the day, market rents were introduced for state housing, and it was one of the most powerful forces increasing extreme poverty in this country, and we are suffering the social consequences of that policy today. The housing crisis, sir, it is a nail in the coffin of the Kiwi dream. A generation of New Zealanders now have no realistic prospect of ever owning their own home. The high cost of housing denies New Zealanders the opportunity that their parents and their grandparents had to have a safe, quality house. A safe, quality house that would give them the opportunity to live good, decent lives, build their capital and improve their prospects. And this government has no solutions.
Interjections between interjections between members who don't have the floor are not permitted. I will call the honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Memo to this government: get a housing policy. That's what I say. Get a housing policy. And here are some ideas to start with. Use the recession as an opportunity to rebuild our housing stock. Provide work and opportunities for tradespeople and apprentices, and do something to stimulate our dying construction industry. Invest resources in emergency housing so people don't have to live in the back of a car. Simply build more public housing. Work with local government to ensure that social housing and affordable housing is included in every new major housing development. Find ways to encourage high-quality, medium-density housing developments in our biggest cities. And for God's sake, close the tax loopholes that drive the tax bubble, the housing bubble that makes housing unaffordable. Mr. Speaker, we support this bill going to the Select Committee, but we do it disgusted by this government's total disinterest in doing anything serious about the housing affordability crisis. Its refusal to even acknowledge that there's a problem. Sir, the best of previous New Zealand governments, they knew how important housing was. They had a vision for this country's future. They were nation builders. They built stuff. And they knew from the experience of the Great Depression and the Second World War that having a roof over your heads was one of the most important factors in living a good life. That Mr. Heatley would bring this pathetic bill to the House says it all.